Somewhere in a Chinese lab, a block of concrete got crushed under a machine that pushes down with the force of 100 elephants standing on one spot. Normal concrete would crack, crumble, and turn to gray dust. This block did not break. It just bent a little and held its shape. The strange part is what made it that strong. It was not steel bars. It was not thicker walls. It was a tiny amount of something called graphene, mixed right into the wet concrete before it dried. We are talking about an amount so small that if you weighed it against the rest of the mix, it would barely tip a kitchen scale. How can something that small make concrete so much stronger? And why did it take scientists more than 100 years to figure this out? Stick around, because the answer involves a material so thin it should not even be able to hold its own shape, and a clever trick that sounds more like a kitchen hack than a science breakthrough. If this is the kind of stuff that blows your mind, hit like and subscribe now. I dig into weird science and real breakthroughs like this every week, and most of them never make it into the regular news. If you subscribe, you will not miss the next one. Section 1. The problem with concrete. To understand why this matters, you need to know something most people never think about. Concrete is everywhere. It is in your sidewalk, your driveway, your school, and the bridge you drive over. It is the most used material on the entire planet other than water. But concrete has always had one big problem. When you mix it, you're combining cement, sand, rocks, and water. The water does two jobs at once. It helps everything harden into rock, and it makes the mix wet enough to pour. Here's the catch. The more water you add, the easier it pours. But the more water you add, the weaker it gets once it dries. Think about packing a snowball. Too much water and it turns to slush. Too little, and it will not stick together at all. Concrete has the exact same fight going on, just on a much bigger scale. For decades, engineers tried to fix this by using less water and more expensive chemicals. That gave them stronger concrete, but it made the mix stiff and hard to work with. Crews had to fight the material just to get it into place. And on top of that, making cement, the glue that holds it all together, creates a huge amount of pollution. Cement making alone is responsible for about 8% of all the carbon pollution on Earth. That is more than every airplane in the sky combined. So the world needed concrete that was strong, easy to pour, and did not need so much cement. Here's a number that puts it in perspective. If concrete production were its own country, it would rank third in the world for carbon emissions, behind only China and the United States. One building material ranked above almost every nation on Earth for pollution. For 100 years, nobody could crack that puzzle. To understand how it finally happened, we need to zoom in, way in, all the way down to a material thinner than anything you have ever touched. Section 2, the tiniest material on Earth. In 2004, two scientists in England were messing around with a pencil and a piece of sticky tape. Pencil lead is made of a material called graphite, stacked in thin layers like pages in a book. The scientists kept pressing tape onto the graphite and peeling off thinner and thinner layers. Eventually, they got down to a layer just one atom thick. That layer is called graphene, and it earned them a Nobel Prize. Here is where it gets wild. Graphene is about 200 times stronger than steel, but so light that a sheet big enough to cover a soccer field would weigh less than a single strand of hair. If you tried to poke a hole through a piece of graphene, it would be like trying to poke a hole through steel with a feather. And it is thin beyond anything you can picture. Stack 3 million sheets of graphene on top of each other. That whole stack would only be as tall as a single sheet of paper. For years, scientists knew graphene was incredible. But knowing something is strong and getting it to actually work inside concrete are two very different things. When you dump graphene into wet cement, it does not spread out evenly like sugar in water. It clumps together like hair clumping up in a shower drain. And clumped up graphene does almost nothing to help the concrete. All that strength gets trapped in a few tiny clumps, while the rest of the mix stays just as weak as before. This is the wall that stopped every team that tried this before. They had one of the strongest materials on Earth sitting right there, and they could not get it to spread through the mix. Here is where the story gets interesting, because the fix was not some fancy new machine. It was something close to a trick you have probably used in your own kitchen sink. Section 3. The clumping problem. Think about what happens when you wash a greasy pan with plain water. The grease does not wash away, it just floats around in blobs. But add a drop of dish soap and something changes. The grease breaks into tiny droplets that spread out and rinse clean. The soap works because one end of each soap molecule grabs onto grease and the other end grabs onto water. Researchers, including teams at universities in China, used almost the same idea to fix the graphene clumping problem. Instead of dumping raw graphene straight into the mix, they gave each tiny graphene flake a kind of chemical coating first. This coating acted like the soap. One side of it liked to grab onto water, and the other side liked to grab onto the cement itself. Once the graphene had this coating, it stopped clumping. It spread out evenly through the entire mix on its own. To make that coating stick, the graphene gets blasted with sound waves so strong they shake the flakes apart at a microscopic level, kind of like how a jewelry cleaner uses sound to shake dirt off a ring. That sound bath breaks up the clumps, while the chemical coating locks each flake in place before it can clump back together. Once that problem was solved, the graphene did something amazing inside the concrete. Tiny cracks form deep inside concrete over time in every single building. Once the graphene is spread out evenly, those flakes act like tiny bridges. They grab onto both sides of a crack and hold it together, stopping it from growing bigger. Normal concrete only gets reinforced by thick steel bars placed here and there, mostly near the surface. Graphene reinforces the concrete everywhere at once, down at the level where cracks are barely even born yet, long before they could ever become the kind of crack you would notice with your own eyes. In real lab tests, Chinese university studies found that adding just a small amount of this treated graphene, well under 1% of the cement's weight, boosted the concrete's crushing strength anywhere from 15% to over 40%, depending on the mix. Some of those same tests showed the concrete held up far better against saltwater damage too. That is the moment this stopped being a lab trick and started being something that could actually get poured into real buildings. Section 4. What happens next? This is not just happening in China either. Builders in England have already used graphene concrete to pour a real gym floor using about 30% less material than a normal floor would need, and it hardened in about a day instead of the usual month. In Spain, engineers tested a graphene mix on part of a real reservoir and expect it to last about 50% longer before it needs repairs. Here's why that matters so much. If concrete needs less cement to reach the same strength, that means less pollution from every single building poured. Multiply that across every bridge, tower, and sidewalk built around the world, and you are looking at a real dent in one of the biggest sources of carbon pollution on the planet. It is not perfect yet. Graphene is still expensive to produce, and not every concrete plant has the right equipment to mix it in properly. Scaling this up to every construction site in the world will take real time and real money. The good news is the price is already moving in the right direction. As more companies start producing graphene for things like batteries, electronics, and now concrete, the market for it keeps growing fast, and prices tend to fall as production scales up. Think about where this could matter first. Not your average house, places where concrete takes the worst beating like seawalls, harbor docks, and underground tunnels, where saltwater and pressure wear normal concrete down in a matter of decades. A stronger, crack-resistant concrete could keep those structures standing for generations longer instead of needing constant repairs. But the hardest part of this whole story, the part that stumped scientists for over 100 years, has already been solved in working tests, not just in theory. We spent a century assuming concrete could only ever be so strong. Turns out the limit was never really the concrete. It was that nobody had found the right way to work with it at the smallest possible scale. Now that a few teams have, every building built after this point could end up lighter, stronger, and a lot cleaner for the planet. If this blew your mind even a little, tap that like button and subscribe so you catch the next one. Turn on notifications too, because breakthroughs like this drop long before most news outlets catch on. Here's my question for you. If graphene concrete gets cheap enough to use everywhere, what should we build with it first? Bridges? Skyscrapers? Or something nobody has even thought of yet? Drop your answer below. If you like this one, check out the video on the strongest material ever created in a lab right after this.